Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to St. Peter's Church. Oh, all right, I thought I was speaking to a microphone, but never mind. Welcome to St. Peter's. I've just got to tell you that the toilets and the fire escape are over there, okay? Now, this evening, I'm delighted to say the microphone is not working. All right. Okay. Well, all right. Okay. So anyway, I'm delighted to introduce to you Graham Dixon, who's going to talk to us about the Limpsfield papers.
So with many alternative entertainments on a Friday night, it's really nice to see so many of you here. I'm accompanied this evening by my son, Nicholas, who is going to spare my voice a little, and he's going to read some of the letters and some of the other documents, so you won't have to listen to me all the time, but there'll be two voices. And this is quite exciting because, of course, Delius, I'm not going to say a lot about Delius. Google him when you get back if you don't know about Delius, but clearly one of the major composers of the 20th century. And the fact that he is in the churchyard and the fact that now these letters have come to light is, I think, extremely exciting. And you are the first to hear about it because the Delius Society Journal is publishing an article which I've written about them, 52 pages long, but I will spare you all the footnotes and extraneous detail tonight. We will be home by 11 o'clock if everything goes well. So speaking in 1935 at the interment ceremony for Frederick Delius, Sir Thomas Beecham described Limpsfield in glowing terms. I think that it may be said that nowhere in the breadth of this land could be found a fairer spot than this to satisfy his wish. And the wish to which he was referring was, of course, the composer's desire to rest in a country churchyard in the south of England. At the very outset, I need to acknowledge my debt to Anthony Horsford, who, at one Wednesday coffee morning, well worth attending, he recalled having seen some papers relating to Delius's burial among the church documents. And before long, we were sitting in the church office with the documents spread out on the table. He knew exactly where they were. And this material really sheds new light on the reburial, and it's a reburial, of Delius in Limpsfield. Prompted by our interest, further documentation has now been located amongst the papers of the Delius Trust, and I'm really grateful to Helen Faulkner for supplying me with copies. I'm also grateful to the Rector and PCC here in Limpsfield for supporting and encouraging this research. So without further ado, I should introduce the main characters. Frederick Delius, born in Bradford in 1862, he studied in Germany. That was after his father had sent him to manage a grapefruit plantation in Florida, an occupation in which he had no interest at all because he wanted to be a musician. He studied music in Germany. He then lived in France, the center of cultural life, in Grès-sur-Loing, just south of Paris, for the last decades of his life. His wife, Jelke, an artist of German ancestry. About a year ago, we spoke about her. Then we have Eric Femby, born 1906, a young man from Yorkshire who, hearing that the composer was both blind and paralyzed, offered to live with the Deliuses to help the composer, Frederick, notate his final compositions. Then we have Charles Steer, the rector of Limpsfield, the Harrison sisters, musicians, notably Beatrice and Margaret, living about 2 miles in that direction, Sir Thomas Beecham, a leading conductor of his day, conductor of the London Philharmonic, and finally, but very, very importantly, Archie Brazier, who was the village undertaker. Here we have Delius's house in Grès, just south of Paris. Think London and Limpsfield. There's been much discussion concerning Delius scholars concerning the composer's final resting place. Shortly after his death, in June 1934, He was buried absolutely without ceremony in Grès-sur-Loing, literally without ceremony. They walked to the grave, they put the body in, they covered it. It was the part of the ceremony of the cemetery which was reserved for non-Catholics, and you can see that now. But it was never intended to be his permanent resting place. As far as Limpsfield is concerned, both Eric Femby, Delius's assistant, and the composer's sister Claire bitterly regretted the choice. Limpsfield may be beautiful, but it's the wrong place. Femby, it seems, would rather have had Frederick's body remain in Grès-sur-Loing, where he lived and worked, while Claire thought it should have returned to his native Yorkshire. He was born in Bradford, and as she says, there are equally beautiful villages and churches of even greater antiquity. She also strongly felt that Delius's civic leaders had been snubbed because they wanted to honour their son. So, was Jelka the widow persuaded by the Harrisons who lived here? Did the conductor Beecham play some role? Well, certainly the Harrisons influenced the choice of Limpsfield because they lived 2 miles in that direction, but the Deliuses had long nurtured the idea of a final resting place in England. And here I'm very, very grateful to Andrew Boyle, a Delius scholar, who pointed out to me a paper in the possession of the Delius Trust, which shows that they had long thought of coming back to England, at least as a final resting place. Jelka writes in 1918, "I wish my body to be conveyed to England and there cremated, the ashes to be placed in an urn and placed beside those of my husband." And this rather contradicts the widely held belief that Frederick had only developed the idea of returning from France when he saw how well his music had been received at the 1929 Delius Festival in London. It was a whole weekend of his music organised by Beecham. So the plan actually to come back had existed for 2 decades. It's of course true that the British appreciated Frederick's music much more than audiences elsewhere. He was hardly ever performed in France and a little performed in Germany up to the time of the First World War. The Deliuses really loved Norway. They dreamt of building a house there in later life. So Norway could have been another option, but it would never have worked because he was really strongly disliked there. This is all another presentation, but his reputation never recovered after he scandalized the entire Norwegian population by making fun of the Norwegian national anthem in one of his works. So Limpsfield it was, and this is the story. What was Limpsfield like in the 1930s? Well, Oxted and Limpsfield and Neighbourhood, published in 1932, paints a charming picture.
Few places present the charm of the English village better or in more typical fashion than Limpsfield. At its north end, a most dignified and picturesque church, standing high above the road, approached by steps and by a long sloping path leading to a fine lich gate, a charming old Georgian rectory opposite, and an old manor house separated from the churchyard by a wall such as is never built in these days. Between the church and the green, the village street, lined with old houses and cottages, set forward and back in endless variety and beauty, and with hardly a modern building of any kind.
Femby has suggested that Limpsfield, with its picturesque environment untouched by modernity, was a reasonable substitute for Norway, which Delius may well have preferred. At this time, Norway was very attractive to British visitors, so it is claimed, for its unspoilt vistas and complete lack of industrialization. The natural pastoral environment of Limpsfield afforded, closer to home, many of the qualities which the English were seeking in Norway. The story begins in Limpsfield, formally, 4 months after the composer's death in June 1934, when on October the 26th, the parochial church council, and there you can see the document, the parochial church council approved the request from the Harrison sisters that Delius should be reinterred in Limpsfield. Frustratingly, the minutes make no mention of any discussion. Why the Harrisons? then, who lived at Foyle Riding, just south of Limpsfield village. Well, Delius had long admired the playing of Beatrice and May Harrison, the famous cellist and violinist. He composed for them himself, and they became close friends. And to the last, the sisters and their mother remained in close contact and visited them in France. So if there was going to be a burial in England, Limpsfield was the place where they had their closest friends. And 9 days after the parochial church council discussion, on Sunday the 4th of November, Frederick's widow, Jelka, visited Limpsfield to inspect the proposed location. She was already extremely frail, having been operated on for bowel cancer. And we can learn about the visit from a letter written by Beatrice Harrison, among the church documents, writing to the rector of Limpsfield the following Tuesday. Mrs. Delius was quite overcome on Sunday. She thought the churchyard was the most ideal spot for Delius, and she did like you so much, and you seemed to make things so easy and smooth over all the difficulties. And there we have the end of the letter with Beatrice Harrison's signature. Beatrice's letter shows that even at this stage, the proposed ceremony involved the great conductor and champion of Delius's music, Sir Thomas Beecham, who of course also lies in the churchyard. Given the exhausting round of Sunday services in Limpsfield at this time, at 7, 8, 10, 11, 2:30 and 6:30, there cannot have been much time actually to meet the rector, particularly since this was the first Sunday in the month which needed an additional communion at 12:05. Remarkably, Jelka's apparently low-key visit to Limpsfield was reported in the national press. The following day, the Daily Telegraph reported every detail.
Madame Delius, the widow of the blind and paralyzed genius, had already decided on the churchyard, and yesterday drove from London to choose the exact spot. The wretched weather, however, prevented her, in her frail state, from leaving her car, and she drove on to the home of her friends, Miss Beatrice Harrison, the cellist, and Miss Margaret Harrison at Oxted. Madame Delius explained her wishes to Miss Beatrice Harrison, who returned to the churchyard. There, in company with the rector of Limpsfield, the Reverend Charles Steer, she carefully selected a sheltered site within the shade of a magnificent yew tree, reputed to be hundreds of years old. Later in the day, as Madame Delius was being driven home by Miss Margaret Harrison, she insisted on leaving the car, and in spite of the heavy rain, visited the selected site. "It is just the spot that he asked for," she said. "I shall bring him over from his temporary grave at Grès-sur-Loire next spring, the season that he loved so much."
One can almost imagine Beatrice standing in the rain, pointing out the vacant plot close to the grave of her mother, that great friend of the Deliuses, who herself had recently passed away. Far from home in Grès-sur-Loire, the presence of the Harrison matriarch surely made this location even more congenial for Jelka. Some surviving correspondence demonstrates that there were objections. One series of exchanges survives from a particularly passionate member of the public, I should say also a particularly angry member of the public, a certain C.M. Gom. Mrs. Gom was forthright when she saw the reports in the press. "Reverend Sir, enclosed cuttings deeply interest me as to why Delius remains can be interred in one of our ancient churchyards. I have on more than one occasion had it thrust home that such secret spots were for parishioners only, and not even for unfortunate souls like myself, whose life has nearly always kept them in the towns. I have been refused purchase of a grave in a Surrey churchyard, which hurt very much, and more so on reading these announcements, and I'm sure that Delius was not even our nationality or creed." We do not have the rector's response. Whatever it was, Mrs. Gom was not satisfied. "Dear Vicar," been demoted to a vicar at this point. Dear Vicar, thank you for your letter, re burial of Delius, but you failed to answer my question. Why is a foreigner that died abroad and not a member of the Church of England to be brought and buried in a spot that very many of our own people would desire and are yet not entitled to? Mrs. Gomm was not giving up and continued to write, and finally the rector responded. However, throughout the whole correspondence, he thought she was male. So Nicholas has not misread what follows.
Dear Mr. Gomm, thank you very much indeed for your continued interest in the affairs of this parish. I can see no reason to alter my decision. It has not been my custom to inquire into the religious beliefs or non-beliefs of those who see burial here. If, however, he was an unbeliever, I can only hope that his burial among our folk here may perhaps be of benefit to his poor soul, while it will not harm them.
I think we can probably at least have some sympathy for her, though, because I don't think that the rector really answers her question. Why should someone from Grès-sur-Loing be prioritised over someone from Dulwich? There are people from Dulwich here this evening, of course. Apart from pleasing the Harrisons, the rector might well have believed that the national church should find space for great English people, regardless of their beliefs. Think Westminster Abbey and Darwin. However, let's set... that which you should have seen was the final response from the Reverend Steer, which is there amongst our papers. But setting the record straight, we have Delius's baptismal certificate in the Church of England. Delius was English. He was born in Bradford of German parentage and technically a member of the Church of England by baptism. The German Lutheran congregation, of which his family became stalwart members, was not actually founded in Bradford until the following decade. Frederick, throughout his life, was known for his atheism, but there is one hint that his attitude towards religion might have softened. Beatrice Harrison wrote about this in 1946. Delius was never an unbeliever. He was a great admirer of my mother, and we used to talk at length about his beloved music. He had a great sense of mischief before he was ill, and he had a great sense of mischief before he was ill, and said that he did not believe just to tease his old father, who was so terribly strict, but he always said that music was his religion, and that he would find his ideal in the next world. Well, Beatrice rather leaps around in this quotation from the question of Delius's religious beliefs to the fact that he admired Mrs. Harrison. Perhaps she's trying to say that he respected her faith. She continues by saying music was his religion, and it might have been thought that Beatrice could not bear the idea of Frederick, her dear friend, suffering the traditional torments of eternal damnation, and consoled herself by confecting this gloss. Despite explaining to Mrs. Gomm in 1934 that Delius's attitude of mind was different from that commonly supposed, 11 years later, the rector writes that Delius was a determined atheist. As for the comment about Delius teasing his authoritarian father, a pillar of the Bradford Lutheran Church, well, that sounds like normal family life. There seems to be little evidence that Frederick, the devoted admirer of Nietzsche, abandoned his atheistic position in later life. Apart from dealing with any protests, one might imagine that the rector came to regret his decision to bury Delius here in the churchyard, because the tasks proved really exhausting. There was wrangling about the date, and the process for importing human remains to England was indeed not totally clear. This is the rector writing to Jelka, and it is absolutely astonishing how late plans were taking place. In the middle of April, we remember the burial was at the end of May, in the middle of April, the date was still a subject for debate. One of the key documents amongst the Limpsfield papers is a letter from the rector to Jelka Delius in April 1935, in which he sets out his thinking.
I do not think that we can have the actual interment on a Sunday, as there are many things to be considered. A good deal of work in preparation and in filling in the grave, the impossibility of having the coffin in the church on a Saturday night and Sunday morning, with all the Sunday services going on, etc. What I should suggest is that the actual interment should take place on the Saturday, either by using an earlier boat for the crossing, or coming by the boat you mention, but on the Friday. The coffin could, in the latter case, remain in the church that night, and the interment take place at a convenient time on the Saturday. On the Sunday, we could have a memorial service at the time you mention, 4 o'clock, with such arrangements as Thomas Beecham would like to make, either inside the church or at the graveside, or both.
The primary question here is how the timing would work. Given the busy round of services, it looks as if the rector might have wished to avoid Sunday. After all, Saturday afternoon would also have provided a convenient moment when people could travel down from London to pay their respects. And this is Jelka writing to the rector. Other exchanges must have taken place in very quick succession, since when Jelka Delius wrote to the rector a few days later, Beecham, yes, Beecham, seems to have decided on the date. This would require some modification in the ceremonies as originally planned by Steer. And I quote now from Jelka's letter. Dear Mr. Steer, Sir Thomas Beecham has fixed my late husband's interment at Limpsfield for May the 26th. That is, if the date suits you. As you know, he is terribly busy, but the 26th of May was free. He says it must take place on a Sunday so as to make it possible for a number of people to go to Limpsfield. Sir Thomas told me to leave the arrangements for the music to him, and he intends to bring down part of the London Philharmonic Orchestra. I am to get the coffin disinterred here in time so that he can leave on a motor hearse on Saturday morning the 25th, if it is to arrive in Boulogne in time to get on the evening boat. On the English side of the channel, the English undertakers are to meet us and drive the coffin straight to Limpsfield. Can you receive it there at, say, 9 p.m.? I shall have all the papers in readiness. And then it always makes me smile. We can see her signature here at the end of the letter. This does make me smile. She then says to the rector, but will there be any difficulty about getting it on the boat? On a more serious note, she then adds, I would like to have the grave tiled and cemented inside and to keep enough space to hold also my own coffin when the time comes. In the letter, Jelka also refers to leaving space in the grave for her own burial when the time comes. And sadly, as we now know, that time came only a few days after that of her husband. She arrived in England, but was too unwell to attend either his interment or the memorial service. She was hospitalized in Kensington, although Beecham's speech was recorded and played to her by a representative of the BBC the same evening. Her mention in the letter of the rector's great kindness does indeed imply that she's not an unwilling participant in a plan hatched by Beecham or the Harrisons, but rather grateful that arrangements were being made to fulfill a complex plan with appropriate sensitivity. Jelka's letter also informed the rector that Femby would liaise with everyone and clarify the arrangements. And within a few days, Femby was in London and wrote to the rector to arrange a visit to Limpsfield. He was also liaising with Beecham about the music and discussing practical questions with Mr. Archie Brazier, the long-standing village undertaker and builder. Letters in the possession of the Delius Trust make clear the extent to which Brazier, the undertaker, was directly involved in the planning. On the 30th of April, Fenby wrote to Brazier confirming the arrangements they'd previously discussed in person. A detailed letter gives the dimensions of the coffin, requests space to be left for another burial in the same grave, and also asks for a wheeled bier to be ready at the Lich Gate on account of the weight of the coffin enclosed in a lead container. Remember, he'd been buried in France for a year before this. In his reply, Brazier suggests that it would be best, given the weight of the coffin, if it is placed in the grave on Saturday evening and covered with boards. Trying to maneuver it during a service would have been undignified. This also meant that the undertakers did not need to work on a Sunday, so it was beneficial from various perspectives. Even 1 month before the burial, the means of transport was far from clear. A plan was being discussed to bring the coffin by air to Croydon, London's international airport, situated close to Limpsfield. Writing to Brazier on the 6th of May, Femby confirmed that Mrs. Delius was in complete agreement to proceed with the burial immediately on arrival and cover the grave until the following day. In this letter, Femby also asked whether he might travel from Folkestone to Limpsfield in the hearse. He had accompanied the coffin all the way from Grès-sur-Loing to the French coast, across on the boat, and now the last part of the journey he would like to be in the hearse. We might feel rather sorry for Limpsfield, who learned from Brazier that there would be no room for him in the hearse. It was not legal for a hearse to carry passengers, and moreover there'd be no space because we had Archie Brazier himself, 4 bearers, and the driver already travelling. But Brazier kindly offered to arrange a car to collect Femby from the boat train and bring him to Limpsfield for the brief late-night ceremony. A letter from Femby to the rector. Despite his misgivings about the entire venture, on May the 6th, Femby confirmed the arrangements with the rector and expressed his sincere appreciation of the assistance he was receiving to arrange something which was well beyond the standard remit of a village church. A letter to the rector from Femby, dated the 16th of May, discusses Beecham's participation in the service, confirming the presence of musicians and noting that Beecham wished to give an oration at the graveside. The complicated arrangements by this point were taking their toll on absolutely everyone involved. Besides the legal necessities, there was the coordination of the church, the undertaker and the musicians, and the complexities of transport in France and England. Femby was clearly doing sterling work. However, we should not forget that he was a musician, aged 29, exhausted from living with the Deliuses in Grès, and with no experience in administration. Darting at this point between London, Limpsfield and Grès, he was dealing with an increasingly overburdened rector, a frantically busy conductor who was in the middle of conducting the ring cycle at Covent Garden, if you please, twice, and a widow who was both sorrowing and ailing. The order of service. The affair moved one uneasy stage closer to its conclusion when, on the 21st of May, only 5 days before the service, the rector typed out the order of service. The last sentence is significant. No further changes can be made to the arrangements, full stop. We also note that he prioritised the children's service rather than cancelling it, stating that no early admission was permitted. The village children leaving the church on that day must have been astonished by the general commotion. At this point, it's very useful to have a curate, because at this point the rector gave the curate the job of liaising with Beecham and his office. Clearly, the Reverend Steer needed some support. William seems to have had a keen interest in the arts, because a scrap of paper survives in his hand, sent to the rector, probably in November 1934, proposing the foundation of a Delius festival, much, he says, like the 3 choirs, based around Delius's presence in the churchyard. This never happened. Practical considerations. Letters belonging to the Delius Trust also give some detail about the practicalities. Femby corresponded with the office of the Traffic Manager Continental Department Southern Railways, assuring him that all the necessary regulations had been observed. Incidentally, in case you're interested, the cost of transporting a coffin from Boulogne to Folkestone by ship was £7 and 8 shillings. With his eye for detail, Femby also inquired about purchasing a single second-class ticket for the boat. It was either going to be 71 francs and 25 centimes at Boulogne, or, if there was insufficient time, he could come to Victoria Station later and pay 19 shillings. Clearly, the whole project would have fallen flat had Delius's coffin not been allowed to leave France, or indeed to enter England. The French formalities seem to have been relatively simple and sorted quickly through the town hall in Grès-sur-Loing. And that was all done by early April. And there we have part of the French documentation, which I've been lucky to see. I've also met the man who did the final sign-off, the son of the mayor at the time, whom I met in Grès-sur-Loing, which is an extraordinary thing, because I was talking about Delius and Limpsfield, and this gentleman said it was my father that signed the document. So there you go. However, in England, things were running late. On the 8th of May, less than 3 weeks before the ceremony, the rector wrote to the Home Office, only to be told that the request should be directed to the Customs Office. On May the 15th, not more than a week before the proposed arrival of Delius's remains, the Customs Office outlined the process, including the formalities, which also needed to involve the local registrar, Surrey County Council. Only 5 days before the arrival of the coffin, the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages in Caterham was informing the rector that certain papers were essential. We can only assume that this was expedited very rapidly, since the coffin containing Delius's mortal remains arrived, we presume, legally in England. Apart from a specimen ticket filed away among our documents, no information about the conduct of the ceremony itself on the day emerges from what we actually still have amongst the Limpsfield papers. But the Surrey Mirror and County Post reported that the coffin arrived after its long journey at around 11:30 p.m. The brief service of committal, this is the Surrey Mirror, the brief service of committal was performed by the rector, the only light being afforded by 2 flickering hurricane lamps, one at the head and the other at the foot of the grave, and intermittently by the startling glare of the flashlights of the press photographers. The only mourners were Mr. Eric Fenby, who was Delius's secretary companion and his friend, and Miss May Harrison. There is a volume of the Delius Society Journal in which the then organist of the church also claims to have been present on that occasion. As for the ceremony itself, the Daily Telegraph report of May the 27th fills the void.
On this radiant afternoon, in a scene homely and harmonious, Frederick Delius's last desire was carried into effect, the desire that his resting place should be in an English village churchyard. Delius, lover of beauty and master of harmony, would have approved of her choice of this green valley under the ramparts of the North Downs. There could not have been a lovelier May day. The new green looked burnished by the sun. It seemed as though nature were participating in the last honours accorded to the poetic musician whose best inspiration had always been her beauty. Limpsfield Church was far too small for the attendance. An hour before the service, there was a queue at the south porch. It included parties of students from the London schools of music. Some were in ramblers' shirts and shorts. Numbers of eminent musicians were present, including Dr. Vaughan Williams. 100 yards from Limpsfield Church, we had, a few minutes before, listened to the cuckoo piping its minor thirds hidden in greenery. The grave lies in the shadow of a veteran yew. The musician's admirers who make a pilgrimage there will be rewarded with one of the pleasantest of prospects, with the downs to the north, a smiling valley eastward, and close at hand the 13th century church, with all tones of grey and brown in its weathered stones.
Four works by Delius were played on this occasion, and the orchestra was actually positioned where the organ now is. Someone actually drew a diagram of where people were sitting and where the orchestra was. The four works were Summer Night on the River, Serenade from Hassan, the Elegy for Cello and Orchestra, and On Hearing the First Cuckoo in Spring. Eric Femby, Delius's amanuensis, his assistant, left an organ arrangement of the Serenade from Hassan. It's very short, and I'm going to play it now, because it would be a pity not to hear some of his music this evening, particularly one of the pieces which was heard at the funeral. So just give me 1 second. Now I've got to find where I was. I didn't actually show you the title page of the Serenade. Totally out of print these days. I was very fortunate to find it on eBay. So it probably hasn't been heard here maybe since the day, because that organ arrangement, as I say, has been completely forgotten. Present at the service was Felix Abrahamian. He was a music critic, an author, and a concert promoter, and also a fantastic keeper of journals, of diaries. He'd visited Grès-sur-Loing, I think as an 18-year-old, very precocious, and basically knocked on the composer's door a year before the composer's death. Very, very precocious young man. And his diaries provide one of the few eyewitness accounts of the ceremonies. It's interesting to note that he felt it was really inappropriate that the Limpsfield Tennis Club opposite the church carried on absolutely oblivious throughout all the proceedings. He also notes the enormous queue forming whilst the children's service was in progress, and records a mad and irreverent scramble when the cry, "Tickets only," was finally heard. And although I think Nicholas read that Vaughan Williams was present on that occasion, actually somehow in the scrum, Vaughan Williams failed to get inside the church and had to wait out in the churchyard until the congregation processed to the graveside. The other thing that Felix Abrahamian did was he sketched the layout of the church, and as I said, the orchestra was positioned where the organ stands. So rather nicely, you've heard the music coming from exactly the same spot as it did on that occasion. The parish magazine, as well as obviously the national newspapers, recorded the interment, mentioning those involved in making the arrangements.
On Sunday, May the 26th, were laid to rest the remains of Frederick Delius, the composer, who died in June 1934 at Grès-sur-Loing, near Fontainebleau. The church was packed to capacity for the first part of the service, during which the London Philharmonic Orchestra played 4 selections from Delius's works. The arrangements made by the wardens, sidesmen, and Mr. Brazier were perfect, as was the afternoon, so that a notable ceremony was carried out in a manner befitting the traditions of Limpsfield. The news of Mrs. Delius's death has come during the writing of these words. May they rest together in peace.
A further note in the parish magazine mentions that Jelka had joined her husband in the churchyard only 4 days later. The Daily Telegraph reported this in its in memoriam column on the 31st of May. Mrs. Delius was buried yesterday by the side of her husband in the village churchyard at Limpsfield, Surrey. The simple burial service, in which there was no music, was taken by the Reverend C. Steer, the vicar. Once again, Felix Abrahamian made the journey to Limpsfield to honour, in his words, to honour the memory of a sweet and gracious old lady. He noted, rather charmingly, that it was Ascension Day and that the white blooms in the church made it look particularly lovely. Having arrived early, he walked a narrow footpath running alongside the length of the churchyard and remarked that the utter tranquility was astounding. One ought to grow up a saint in such surroundings. Draw your own conclusions. He described the scene. The churchyard was bright and warm, and all was beautiful. Just as the coffin was lowered into the grave, the plough in the field yonder slowly crossed the gap between the 2 trees. In his diary he recollects, "Slowly I left the place and made for Oxted. The last chapter had been written." The rector's letter in the parish magazine for June shows that he was indeed rather wearied by the whole affair. There were no appreciative remarks about Frederick or Jelka, nothing about the exceptional occasion, no proposed Delius festival. This is what he wrote.
Though the clicking of cameras was not so loud as the roar of guns, the other circumstances of the burial of Frederick Delius strongly reminded me of the preliminary bombardment before some great attack in the dark during the war. From all sides there came the flashes of the magnesium lights as we lowered the coffin to its resting place after its long journey from France. The actual funeral service the next afternoon, Sunday, May the 26th, was a great contrast. The quiet and orderliness and reverence of everyone was a great relief. Cameras, though present, were not obtrusively so, and there was ample justification for Sir Thomas Beecham's remark that no more beautiful spot and more fitting surroundings could have been found in England.
And here we see on the screen a letter from Fenby to the rector, dating from August. Because if the rector was rather out of sorts about the whole affair by the time he was writing in the parish magazine, a few months later, he really had good reason to be out of sorts. We do not have his original letter, but Fenby's reply records that the Reverend Steer was not best pleased. Two issues needed urgent attention: the provision of a headstone and the payment for the undertaker. Fenby was evidently distressed that the Harrisons had not dealt with the question of marking the grave and offered to resolve matters from his own pocket if the Harrisons did not act swiftly. Remember, we're talking about a 29, 30-year-old man saying, "I'll just pay for it myself," which shows how distressed he was by the situation. And as for Mr. Brazier, who'd travelled to Folkestone, prepared the grave, corresponded with Fenby, and made all the arrangements, it seems really unfair that no immediate remuneration was forthcoming. It also seems completely unacceptable, if I can, in my humble opinion, that Brazier needed to pursue a firm of London solicitors and wait for his payment once the estate was settled, and Fenby offered to call the solicitors and sort things out. However, it seems a pity to conclude on a sour note. After all, we've been thinking about the homecoming of one of England's greatest composers. He would surely be delighted that his wish to repose here had been fulfilled, that Jelka was at his side, and that his reinterment had been attended by so many notable musicians and students who had hiked down to Limpsfield for the occasion. It seems appropriate, therefore, to leave the last word to a member of the public, very happily preserved amongst the Limpsfield papers. This is not a musician, but he was an estate agent, someone who admired the music of Delius. And on hearing that the composer's remains were being transported to Limpsfield, Percival Callow penned a poem in honour of the composer, suggesting that the rector could have it printed and sold for church funds or other village purposes. The spontaneous gesture from a genuine music lover, I think, makes a pleasing conclusion to our journey through the Limpsfield papers. There was a little footnote there.
If from some happier clime he sees this little band of devotees his latest wish fulfill, by them his ashes laid to rest in churchyard old, 'twas his request, upon a Surrey hill, then deep and quiet his joy today, while they their avocations stay to do his gentle will. O let us glory in the deed, who now a mighty column lead along this reverent earth, a concourse measureless sublime, whose end shall be the end of time, and they proclaim the worth of Delius, great and glorious dead. Lay laurels on this garden bed, till ceases human birth.
But the story is not quite finished. And there's the Percival Callow poem, still here amongst our Limpsfield papers. But as I said, the story is not quite finished. Just when we presume the rector had thought that the frenzy had died down, he received an article from the Reverend Charles L. Tweedale, an enthusiastic proponent of spiritualism, an activity contacting the departed roundly condemned in the 1930s by the Church of England. Bishop of London, I think, had published about that time about the evils of spiritualism. Tweedale describes how his wife had prophesied both Frederick's death and that of Jelka. And at the time of Jelka's death, their Swiss musical box apparently played spontaneously without being wound up. It's all written in this article in the journal, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Light on Spiritualism and Psychical Research. Rush home to look at it in your own copies. Even more astonishing, from beyond the grave, is the voice of the composer addressing his sister through a spirit medium and giving a message to the Reverend Tweedale from beyond the grave. He commanded his sister to record her memories of him and gave her a strict deadline of 24 months to accomplish the task. So Tweedale contacted Delius' sister Claire, and that's the memoir. It actually happened. So how ironic then that Delius, described by one biographer as a ferocious, hard-headed materialist of the late 19th century rationalist type, should make his supposed final appearance through a spiritualist intermediary and leave a message for his sister with an eccentric Anglican clergyman. One can only hope, in conclusion, that rather than frantically trying to issue instructions from the great beyond, Delius is quietly reposing here in charming Limpsfield, reunited with his lifelong companion Jelka, as was their desire, close to his champion and friend Sir Thomas Beecham, and in the rector's words, surrounded by the kind, friendly folk of the village. Thank you very much. Questions and observations.
Yes, okay. Yes, right. Graham has kindly said that he will take some questions, if there are any now.
I'm really conscious there are people who've lived here a lot longer than I have, and that whilst I have this documentary knowledge of it, there may well be some reminiscences, some things passed on, which, you know, either can correct some of these things or indeed add to what we know. Yeah, absolutely. So I should have said that when I showed you that slide. We have Nicholas to be grateful here because Nicholas worked out where that now is. And anyone, any guesses? Bradford. Yeah, it's in the German Lutheran Church in Bradford. Founded, if my memory is correct, in I think 1870, but it's about a decade after Delius's own birth, which is why he was baptized in what is now Bradford Cathedral, because there was no German Lutheran church. It's also incorrect. There was a great correspondence, because it should be, and some Delius expert will correct me, but it should, I think, be Frederick Theodor Albert, rather than Frederick Albert Theodor. I think someone wrote to the parish magazine about that many years ago. Yeah, I will. Someone is asking, and I don't know, and maybe someone here does know, how the circumstances of the stone being moved to Bradford. I mean, I think it's a lovely gesture, but I know nothing about how that happened. I haven't researched that. Maybe there's something in one of the parish magazines, but I don't know if anyone here knows. Yeah. I know, I mean, I won't bore you with it this evening, and it isn't in the Delius Society Journal article, but there is further correspondence about 10 years after all of this happens, about the state of the stone, because this did deteriorate quite quickly, and people visiting, including I think some American visitors who were major admirers of his music, were quite shocked by the state of the stone about 10 years later. But that's not at the front of my mind, but it will be interesting. There's some more papers which actually pick up the story, mainly about the maintenance of the stone about 10 years later.
A couple of things. A corollary is that Thomas Beecham, he too was buried somewhere else. He was buried in Brookwood Cemetery, and because Lady Beecham felt it was going into disrepair, he was a late arrival in Limpsfield. And when was that?
I forget the year, but there's a letter. Yeah, there is a letter about that filed in the along with the Limpsfield documents. I didn't include that because that's another subject, but it's interesting. We've got 2 reburials, and that one was done on the basis that I think, if I get this wrong, but it's something like Beecham's stepson had lived in Limpsfield at some point, and they sort of, did it on that basis. A bit tenuous, I should say.
Well, I was administrator at the time, so I was a bit involved in the arrangements. It was his widow that came and spoke to the rector and arranged.
Yes. She's still alive, actually. Yes, I think she's in her 90s now, living in Suffolk, I think.
Just another corollary of things that some people may remember that I think it was in 2012, a film was made about the life of Delius by John Bridcut, who's made films about a lot of famous composers, and the midnight burial was reconstructed, and some of us are in the film, and we stood out there on January afternoon about 4 o'clock for hours.
Yes.
The actual clip is about 12 seconds. You can see, because of our white hair, you can see me, Peter Hindley, and indeed 1 or 2 other locals. Some of them passed away, but we were in the film.
Yeah, fantastic, yes. We'll look forward to your starring moment. Don't forget, YouTube this evening when we get home.
The fee was minimal.
It usually is.
Can I take the mic?
Yeah, it's all yours.
Good evening, I'm Helen. I am the current rector of St Peter's, Limpsfield, and I do not do services at 6, 8, 10, 12, 2 o'clock, but I am nonetheless very busy. I say that I am the current rector because, of course, we all know we have the Chancellor of the Diocese here this evening, and he will be acutely aware as well that we are merely custodians of these wonderful buildings and indeed their adjoining churchyards as well. And so, as custodians, we need to be, of course, preserving the fabric that we have, enhancing all that we have, but also remembering what has gone before us. And that, of course, is what has been brought to life this evening. Our whole heritage here is really formed by all that has gone before us, and we still enjoy a very strong musical worship in this church. We have a wonderful organist, 2 wonderful organists, a wonderful choir, and we benefit, I believe, from the people that have gone before us. And so I would just like to say thank you very much indeed to Graham and indeed to Anthony, who knew of these letters being in the parish office. But thank you, Graham, for bringing all of this to life for us. The other thing that struck me was that actually the letters that I write today are not very different from the ones that appeared this evening. I have written many an email beginning, "I am grateful for your continued interest in this parish." And I'm very grateful for Graham's interest in this parish and for all that he has brought to us this evening. Could we offer him, please, a round of applause?
Join the Delius Society. Have some leaflets.
Whilst you're thinking about that, do come round the corner here and have a drink and some nibbles.
Hey, well done. Yeah, it was great. We should do a double act more often.
I'll have to get you along to some of my genealogy course.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, I can read that. I can read all the weird
Transferring bills and things, yeah.
Great, yeah. That will be fun. Let me just switch this. Down. That's good. I'll just leave everything here, actually. Yeah, that's fine. Just leave it all here. It's fine. Oh, no, thank you. Do you know each other?
Are you Anthony? We did meet once before. Yes, in fact, I think the time we met was at his previous talk. So
it may have been.
nice to see you again.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, isn't it? I can't remember is it picture paints 1,000 words or something like that?
Oh, yes.
But